Stirling Business Podcast from Studio King Street in the heart of Stirling. Today I've got a very interesting guest, Dr. Lee Sparks, Professor of Retail Studies at Stirling University, has a long history with Stirling, but he's not from Stirling originally. So Lee, welcome to Studio King Street.
Thank you.
So the first question I've really got for you, Lee, is how did a Welshman end up in Stirling?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I've lived in Stirling longer than I've lived anywhere else over my life. I came to Stirling first in 1983. I came for 6 months. I've somehow hung around for the best part of 40-odd years now. So short-term contract at the university as a research assistant, and it was expanding at that time. I then got a job as a lecturer and have carried on. They keep on wanting to employ me, so I've actually stayed there all this time. Had offers to go elsewhere, but Stirling's a great place and a great university, and I really enjoy it here.
Fantastic. So tell us a little bit about your career at the university then, since you came in as a research assistant back
I came as a research assistant, became a senior lecturer fairly quickly, and then in 1992 I became Professor of Retail Studies. So that's quite early to become a professor, and since then I've carried on with my professorial activities, but also done a bit on the admin side of the university. So I was Dean of the Business School. I was the founding director of the Graduate School at the university. And then from 2016 to 2024, I was Deputy Principal of the university. Mm-hmm. And I stepped down from that, thankfully, in 2024, and I'm now employed a day a week at the university, doing professorial stuff and a few other bits and pieces. Okay,
so you obviously know a lot of people in the university. It sounds like you've been involved in a number of the different faculties in one way or the other, whether that's been a cross-functional role, like deputy principal, I guess, but also, you've been involved in the business faculty. So I know you're very passionate about business in general, and how, in particular with regards to kind of Stirling and other towns and cities across Scotland. Why is this? Why do you take such a keen interest in business in terms of supporting their activities and initiatives in cities and towns?
It might be worthwhile going back into the real dark past. In 1978, I got a student exchange to go to Australia. I was doing an undergraduate degree at Cambridge. My degree was geography. So geography is all about place for me. It's human geography I was doing. And I went to work for 3 months over in Australia in Townsville in northern Queensland, founded by a Scot, Robert Towns. Townsville was interesting. I worked for the planning department, and they said, you've got to do a project while you're here, and you have two choices. You can either look at the impact of our new regional shopping centre, which has just opened, or you can look at the impact of our major swimming pool. Then they said, the problem is it's winter, 80 degrees Fahrenheit, winter, but the swimming pool's shut. So you have a choice.
But you don't really have a choice.
No, not a choice. It was a Hobson's choice. So I was asked to do some work on the regional shopping centre, and that got me into the impact of change in retailing and how retailing was impacting places at the very early stages of that in Australia. And then I was fortunate enough to get a PhD down in Wales, which allowed me to look at the employment aspects of changes in retailing. And from that, there's been this long-term interest in structural change and social change and how it all interacts. I would be false to say I've always been concerned about the impact of business change like that on town centres and on high streets. I've always felt that retail had to modernise and businesses have to modernise. But I think a realisation came post-2000 that we were pushing that far too far and becoming far too car-centric, and that was damaging our centres. And so that's where the interest in both promoting business, understanding businesses from an academic point of view and a business point of view comes, but then the impacts that businesses have on place.
All right, okay, that's interesting. So I know obviously in our towns and city centres across Scotland, we have a lot of disused buildings now. Okay, I think pretty much if you take Edinburgh and Glasgow out of the equation, although you do find a little bit of it going on there as well. The tend to take care of themselves, those particular locations. But through what bodies and initiatives do you typically get involved in supporting some of that activity that, in some of these kind of lesser known cities and towns in terms of support?
I think the start of really getting heavily involved, I've always been an academic who's always been involved in business. I don't feel that universities are places that somehow should be sacred and people shouldn't go into them, and academics certainly should never leave them. They need to get out and work with business. So I've always had involvement with business, done business projects, done work for some of the major retailers as well as for local governments about impacts and so on. So the big change, I think, came in, and people may recall the Mary Portas report down in England, the Portas Review of High Streets. There was a Scottish equivalent just after, which was the Fraser Review, the National Review of Town Centres.
I've heard that one. Yeah.
And I think those two things are really interesting in that England saw what was going on in place as a retail problem, whereas in Scotland we perceived it as a town centre problem. And I was the academic who was on the National Review of Town Centres, and from that came the Town Centre Action Plan, and then Scotland's Towns Partnership was the organisation that tried to corral and amplify what good things were going on in town centres. And so I've been chair of the board for Scotland's Towns Partnership since 2013, 2014.
Right.
And our role is to try and promote town centres, try and work with government to improve town centres, to try and push government and policymakers to change the landscape for town centres, and to amplify a lot of the good things that are going on. It's interesting that people have the narrative of the death of the high street and the decline of the high street, and place isn't what it is. And the place isn't what it is. Consumers have changed, society's changed, where we live, we work, we play has changed. So we should expect these impacts, which leads to some of those vacant spaces. But if you look around most town centres, they've got some great assets. And you look around most town centres, they've also got some really interesting independent businesses coming into these spaces. And we need to rebalance that narrative that actually there's a lot of good stuff going on. How much more could go on if we actually tilted the playing field back towards town centres and places, because they are the most socially and economically viable opportunities we have. They're really... You never say you come from a retail warehouse park. You say you come from a town, from a place. There's an identity to that, which is really important.
That's an interesting observation, though. So it's kind of the high street, if you like, within our towns, within our cities, have always been, have always related to retail and to a degree hospitality and, cafes and those types of services. But I think the kind of demographic is changing rapidly in terms of, people viewing opportunities differently in our towns. It's all business at the end of the day, but it doesn't necessarily always need to be kind of retail oriented. So where do you think we are with regards to the kind of retail sector at the moment, given, e-commerce, made a big impact in the early days. We had, the COVID stopping people from kind of, going out and shopping and doing their thing. We've now got the cost of living crisis. Where would you say that we currently sit in that kind of retail cycle as a country?
Well, there's no doubt that retailing has had a tough time. It's gone through difficult periods, as you've said. If we think about internet retailing, then online sales are now roughly about 28 to 30% of retail sales. So a big chunk of retail sales has moved away from the physical channel. And there are issues about why that is, how that is. We've also decentralised enormously in where our shops are. So we should expect that impact on our town centres. For retail businesses, they're looking at where their costs are. They're looking at how they get consumers in. Very worried about things like the national insurance employer increase that came in a year and a bit ago, that came out of absolutely nowhere. And they're finding it tough. All these things have really hit them. But underneath that, I think there's an entrepreneurial spirit for independence that are really good. And there's also a lot of smaller chains that are now beginning to expand and recognising that the overexpansion of the big chains, the several hundred stores across the UK, which they've withdrawn from, provides opportunities for things that are perhaps now a bit more locally authentic in a variety of ways. So there's some really interesting things going on underneath that doesn't really get the headlines. Having said that, it's always a struggle. Retailing is always a battle for consumer share of wallet. So that's always going to be the fight that retailers have.
Yeah, and I noticed in Stirling, and I'm sure a lot of the other towns and cities across Scotland are probably in a very kind of similar kind of have a similar focus, but there's a big push around independent Stirling as part of the business improvement district, really supporting those kind of local providers, local suppliers, local retailers, local produce. How big of an impact do you see that having on communities like Stirling and other towns and cities?
That local impact is really important. If we think about the model we built with the decentralised stores and the big national and multinational retailers, then much of the wealth that's generated by that flows outside. It doesn't stay in the local area. And so that's really another reason why places have struggled, because the wealth isn't there. People don't invest in the town centre. They don't invest in the buildings that we've got there. Independent businesses are different because they actually have that network of links that they have. An independent small shopkeeper is probably going to have an independent accountant. They're probably going to have a range of other independent links that they buy from. That builds that ecosystem and ecostructure that allows places to lock that money in. Mm-hmm. Scottish Government's Community Wealth Building Act is all a part of doing that and trying to develop that. So I think there's good things around people recognising what can be done. And in terms of consumers, one of the things during COVID that Scotland's Towns Partnership did was launch a Scotland Loves Local card. Mm-hmm. And the idea of that is you can only use it in physical shops, you can only use it in local areas, and that locks in the spend to the local areas. And that proved really important in keeping spend going in shops during COVID, but also now is a brand in its own right. And again, I think there's a lot more we could put through things like Scotland Loves Local that supports the local businesses, keeps the spend in the local area, and therefore encourages the businesses to invest, but also to spend themselves in the local area. Mm-hmm. That's a real positive cycle if we can develop that more strongly. And I think to go to Stirling, if you look at the independents around in Stirling, you look at some of the developments that have gone on within the town centre, I think that is what we're beginning to see, a much more collaborative, self-sustaining network of businesses that actually is quite distinctive, which is the other important thing. I don't think people really want to come to Stirling to see the same old things they can see anywhere else.
Yeah.
They want to see and come and see things that are different, that are unique, that are part of the place, part of the heritage, and all the different assets that we actually have here that we need to really try and embrace.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I definitely resonate with that with regards to my business here. I'm very city centre centric. I'm right in the heart of Stirling where we're sat now. And our whole kind of philosophy concept is community wealth building, kind of supporting other local businesses, whether that's the local cafe, the bar, the restaurant. We don't have a bar, we don't have a restaurant. Our whole strategy is to push people out into the community to spend their money in the local community, and we get a lot of goodwill from that as a result of being a business doing that type of thing. So I can definitely see how the local impact translates both ways. If we were a large hotel with our own restaurant and bar, we're keeping, which maybe a lot of the larger chains might typically be, they're going to, try and keep as much of that, spend in house. But we're the complete opposite. We're promoting those different types of activities and things outside of the building.
And if you think about the way the hotel chains promote that, they are promoting that you come here and you don't go outside. You stay inside. It is all about trying to keep that spend, as you say, in there. Whereas I think the model that you have here is very different from that point of view. And clearly, one of the other things I've taken on since my semi-retirement is I'm chair of Made in Stirling. Right. So it's the shop over the road from here, the Artist Collective there, and it's great to see some of the paintings in here that have come from the business then. Again, it's about reinforcing what are the links, how can we work together, what are the opportunities to cross-promote here that will tie these businesses together and actually keep that spend and amplify that spend.
Yeah, it's again an interesting observation. We spend a lot of time with Visit Scotland, for example, at their annual Connect event. Got one coming up, I think, in a couple of months' time in Glasgow, and the travel trade in particular is a big focus for us. Being a hotelier, we want to try and bring tour operators and tourists into our property. Well, and the whole objective is, yes, we're a commercial business. We want to generate revenue from that, but the focus is to try and keep people in Stirling for longer. So we typically promote Stirling more than we promote our facility, because we find that if we offer more differentiated things to do when they come to Stirling, so yes, you can come and see the castle and all the historical kind of features like the monument, but people want to do different things. If they're here for 3 or 4 days, well, we can send them to a local cook school or a local craft area within Made in Stirling to do something a bit different to what they would typically do. And we can promote those types of things, with regards to our initiatives. So, yeah, just another good example, I guess, of what you're saying there in terms of bringing communities together and helping each other's businesses be successful.
Yeah, and I think we're beginning to see that ecosystem here. If you just look at the independent shops around in Stirling, you see a large range of that. You mentioned the cook school. They're Made in Stirling, obviously I'm involved in, but you've got Radical Weavers as well. You've got other opportunities to actually keep people within the town centre and to actually to have great experiences, and so much more. And if we go back to the retail issue, how much of retailing is boringly functional as opposed to how much is actually experiential? And I think people want something different, want something more experiential. They want to feel something distinct about it rather than go in, buy something, get out as fast as you can, which is what a lot of retailers have defaulted to in many ways. Mm-hmm. So you asked earlier about where is retailing? I think we're on the cusp of that change. We're seeing more and more of that coming through.
Experiential change.
Yeah. And I think we see the same in places. Why do people want to come to Stirling? It can be because you've got the Wallace, Bannockburn Castle, but actually there's something really good about the heart of Stirling as well, and all of those things fitting together. The same is true of many other town centres across Scotland. When we talk about the problems town centres have or the death of the high street, it's the wrong starting point. The starting point should be, what assets does a place have? Whether it's that theatre we haven't really thought about for too long that could have something done to it, whether it's some of the other buildings that could be repurposed in certain ways, whether we could actually in Stirling get the arcade into some form that would actually be something, or a Victorian gem that is so underused here. There's so many good things we can do in Stirling if we can actually try and pull that together. And going back to government, get government to actually recognise that town centres need to be supported and should be supported because of all of the good things that happen in them and all the accessibility they have that you don't get for many of these other things elsewhere.
Yeah, as you say, there's some beautiful assets, particularly in some of the ageing or older cities like Stirling that have just sat there gathering dust for a long, long time. And, from an entrepreneur perspective, property development, property investment, what I'm certainly starting to see within my communities, because I'm part of some of those communities myself, I'm a property developer. That's ultimately what I'm at the heart of what I've become a hotelier. That wasn't by design. We built a hotel, developed a hotel, and that's we've gone into the operational phase now. But I'm certainly starting to see a lot of innovation coming from private investors, private investment into the area, and developers looking to complete the change the use of buildings to become something very different to what they were originally intended to be, whether that be historically retail or council buildings or municipal buildings, etc. What are you seeing from an entrepreneurship across Scotland? Are you seeing much of that yourself in the work that you do?
Yeah, I think there's real interest in the assets that are around the place. There's a difficulty in some cases unlocking some of the finance. There's some reticence in some places from some councils about what's actually been taking place in those buildings. How can they change the use to that? It's something they're not quite as used to as they might be. So there's sometimes a bit of sort of gulp, We're also talking in many cases, and this is again a prime example where we're talking about upper floors as well. So we've got to think of the town centre not just on the ground floor and the retail component we've always traditionally had, but how do we get to use the great spaces that are up here? How do we change those spaces and get access to them? And I think we're seeing that. It's a slower process than it should be. I think there are things around the cost structures that national government could do things with. There are things about adding disincentives to out-of-town developments or making them pay the real cost that they're actually putting on the environment and the economy and on society. And that's not just retailing, that's housing all of the out-of-town developments we have. If we build car-centric places, people are going to be locked into those places through the car. We actually want them to be closer to town. We want people living in the town centre. We want footfall and vibrancy in the town centre and reasons for people to engage in the town centre. Are we seeing that? Yes. Are we seeing enough of it? Not really. Having talked to a number of developers and some of the big schemes about housing in town centres, the difficulties, the cost, the sequencing you have to do to unlock the revenue stream in order to afford the next bit of it, that's really not understood as well as it might be. So the question is, how can we get local and national governments to recognise that by being a bit more flexible, actually an awful lot of good can come from it?
Yeah, I mean, Stirling, another good example. We're a university town. The connection between the university and the city centre needs to obviously continue to develop and get stronger because, we're bringing footfall in through students or, parents visiting their kids and what have you that are at university here. So there's obviously the connection with, different kind of industries and sectors as well between the university. So film and media being a great example of that. What's your perspective of how we could be doing better in that regard?
It's interesting to me that when the university was established in the 1960s, and I wasn't there at that time, it was set up really because the town council drove it. It wasn't Stirling Regional Council. It wasn't Central Region at that time. It wasn't Stirling in the broader sense we have now. It was the town drove the establishment of the university and very much saw it as something that would work in close proximity to the city centre, then the town centre. I think over time that perhaps hasn't worked as much as we would have liked it to work. Having said that, the businesses do benefit in all sorts of ways because if we've got 13,000 students there for a number of weeks of the year, then that is a real boost to both bars, restaurants, hospitality when their parents come, say, for graduation and for other visits. But I think there are things that could be promoted rather better about the facilities we have in the centre, about reasons to come to Stirling as a place, which also means why you come as a student as well, and then how the businesses can target that particular demographic. It is a big component of what the population of Stirling is, and I think isn't as visible in the town centre as it might be. It would be nice to see a bit more visibility.
I could totally resonate with that. I went to Manchester, for example, and the whole ethos of being a student in Manchester was based around the vibrance of the city for students.
Yeah, when I was deputy principal, we talked an awful lot about the fact that if Stirling as a city centre didn't look welcoming, didn't feel welcoming, didn't have the facilities that students might want, then it's a much harder sell for us to get students to come for the universities. Because as much as an academic, I'd love to say they only come because the academic courses are brilliant, and they are. That's not true. They have a life beyond the lecture hall, so they need to feel comfortable in a place. Now, Stirling's quite good around some of those things. It's one of the best places to live in the UK, one of the safest cities to have a university in the UK. It's got some things that resonate with particular student groups. So I think there's a lot more the university could do with the town centre around that.
And I think there are natural things happening as well, I guess, from a business perspective, like the film studio, but then also things like the Lumo Trains initiative that's starting probably within a month or two, where they're going to be kind of providing a service 4 times a day directly from London straight into Stirling. So they've obviously seen, they're a commercial business, they've seen some benefit in doing that to try and kind of drive more footfall to Stirling. We've interviewed the chief executive on this podcast, and his big ethos, he was telling us, is to help promote local businesses, have their produce, from Stirling, for example, sold on the trains, so that there's a kind of branding and a connection with Stirling, as well as just providing a kind of rail service. So they're looking for differentiation and potentially loyalty programs and what have you too. So all of these kind of things are all going to help. But again, making that connection back to the university, I guess, is going to be pretty critical, and like maybe some more thought needs to potentially go into that.
It is all about connections. You know, the arts and humanities departments certainly have worked with Made in Stirling as an example of that.
Very
I think
logical,
there are other opportunities that could be done there. I think the business school and the opportunities it could give its students by working with local businesses in all sorts of ways, I think is really, really good. I'm always told that our digital media students tend to go to Glasgow and Edinburgh once they graduate because there's no facilities and no opportunities here in Stirling. The film studios and some of the developments around that may hopefully change those sort of things. We have a world-renowned Institute of Aquaculture, which has just opened the National Aquaculture Technology Innovation Hub up there. Yeah. So that's going to be bringing national, international people in there.
On the world stage as well, right?
Yeah, so
right up there.
This is the sort of thing we ought to be using to promote the town centre when we're doing that from the university point of view, and vice versa. You know, I think most people in the university are proud that actually the university is in Stirling, and it is a bit different.
And it is a stunning campus. I don't think I've seen many campuses quite like it.
It is a fabulous environment, but equally having the city centre and all the other good things about Stirling on the doorstep as well is what makes that experience. It's not just locking our students into the campus. But I think we don't make enough of that and don't think through what the ideas are at the moment.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of our conversation, Lee. So I'm going to ask you this question. Now older, wiser, very experienced in the world of academia and business. You've obviously travelled the world and you've seen it in other countries as well, like Australia you mentioned earlier. What would you say to your younger self if you were starting out your career again?
I think the life of academics has now become somewhat different than it was when I started out. A bit of the story I didn't say is that when I came to Stirling, we just had massive cuts in Stirling, the Thatcher cuts of the university, and that allowed film and media, aquaculture, a range of other subjects, including retail and business, to go off and do what they wanted to do. So we were given licensed by the then principal, the then head management of the university, to be as entrepreneurial as we possibly could be and to make sure you talked to business all the way through and got what they wanted as part of the academic side. And that was great. I think we began to get a bit more middle-aged as a university and individually, and lost a bit of that. And I think what universities now need to do, and therefore what I'd say is recapture that spirit now of what we had, to really, get out and do things. I had a great time. I wouldn't have stayed here for 40 odd years if I hadn't been great and had real opportunities. So there's, there's not much I'd say to that 20-year-old at that point that I wouldn't want to do different. But I think somewhere along the way we lost that sense of real spirit of entrepreneurship, adventure, working with business, and feeling that actually if I spent most of the time outside the university, I was probably doing a better job for the university as a consequence.
Interesting. Very interesting. So in terms of where the universities in general, let's take Scotland because it's obviously a kind of big geography in itself. Do you think they're in? Are we about to see a change? Do you think there needs to be a wave of innovation across our universities? You hear in the press, for example, a lot of universities are kind of struggling financially. Lack of international students coming in and other reasons for that. What would you say, just to kind of round us off here, some of the things that you would like to see change in the universities across Scotland?
Universities as a whole within Scotland and also within the UK generally are struggling financially. They're struggling financially because some of the bases on which they were told to plan and asked to plan were cut away from them by UK government changes, and Brexit had a big impact on that. That took away our European students. The immigration arguments have taken away most of the international student numbers that we had. Now, why those are in the immigration numbers is a bizarre figure. So in some senses, things have been done to universities that they didn't expect, and that's caused some of the financial issues. Having said that, universities have also internally, I think, valued some of the wrong things. So valuing research for its own sake as opposed to research that is for economy's sake, for business sake.
Just back to your point earlier about you were left to be entrepreneurial.
They are, like many organisations, when they grow to reasonable sizes, and they are big, the universities are big organisations, they do tend to get a bit bureaucratic, a bit centralised, and freeing up some of that and building back to that entrepreneurial state, I think, would be a very good thing for most universities, and getting our students out into opportunities to work with businesses over periods of their degrees. And I think we're seeing more of that coming through now. I think that can only be for the better.
Brilliant. Well, Lee, thank you for coming along. Really appreciated the time. Vast of experience from both an academic and a business perspective. So it's great to have you on the show. And don't be a stranger. We'd love to have you back again at some point in the future.
Happy to.
Thank you very much, Lee.
No.
So we come to another conclusion of another episode of the Stirling Business Podcast. Today's guest was Dr. Lee Sparks, Professor of Retail Studies at the university. So thank you, Lee, for all of your words of wisdom. And until we have our next episode, take care and we'll speak again soon.